Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Middle East, and more specifically what is now the State of Israel, is of course the birthplace of Jesus Christ and the Christian faith. That said, Christians do not necessarily enjoy freedom of religion in most of the countries in the region and repeatedly are faced with harassment, persecution, and discrimination by either regimes or individuals. To discuss the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, we're joined here in the studio by Mr. Chris Mitchell, who is the Middle East Bureau Chief of the Christian Broadcasters Network. Welcome.
Good to be here, Jonathan.
I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, as well as Mr. Michael Kerem, who is the Middle East and Islamic Affairs analyst, and Dr. Susanna Kokkonen, who is the International Director for the Hope for Persecuted Peoples. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Oren, give us update on the latest developments pertaining to the persecution of Christians in this region.
Well, of course, the Middle East is an amalgam of nations, tribes, religions, ethnic groups, and unfortunately, even though the Judeo-Christian tradition started it all, now the predominant groups are Arab, and within the Arab community, Muslim rather than Christian. Mm-hmm. And Islam, being what it is, the way the faithful perceive it, is a total religion. And in principle, every country where Islam reigns should become eventually, should be run according to religion. And therefore, they are not tolerant towards other religions, especially not towards those who want to convert from Islam to another religion, namely Christianity. And if you look at the list of countries where Christians are being persecuted around the world, Muslim countries, and especially in the Middle East, also in Asia and Africa, but in the Middle East in particular, the Christian minorities, because there is no Christian majority country, the Christian minorities are being persecuted, and outside forces, other governments should always keep an eye on those regimes which do not act forcefully enough against those groups within them, or even the regimes themselves, which persecute Christians.
Mr. Mitchell, you've been covering Christians in the Middle East for quite some time now. And if we look back to a century ago when Christians were about 20% of the entire population of the Middle East, today we're talking about figures between 2 to 4%. Of course, it varies because the different statistics don't always match each other. What is the reason for this significant decrease, considering that it's not only demographic growth that brought about this reality?
Well, I think in many ways it's the rise of radical Islam, and particularly in the last several years, I think we see that accelerated with the rise of ISIS in 2014. We were up there after ISIS took over much of Syria and northern Iraq. And they literally fled for their lives. And it's one of the great tragedies, I think, in the last several years. If you go to a place like Karakosh, where 60,000 Christians literally fled for their lives. It was liberated by the Kurdish army, the Peshmerga, but going back is just almost insurmountable for them, because much of the infrastructure has been destroyed, maybe the homes been destroyed, the church has been defaced, so it's very difficult for them to go back and resettle in that land. So I would say, to your question, the rise of radical Islam, just trying to eliminate Christian presence in many of these lands.
Mr. Kerem, you've traveled extensively across the Middle East, also worked with different Christian communities, and have been able to see firsthand the challenges Christians face in this region. How do you see Christians actually dealing with the persecution directed at them?
Well, on one side, they have to deal with it in a way that sometimes just means leaving the area. And I think that's the whole sort of emphasis behind what's happening, whether it's Arab nationalism, whether it's Shiite Islam, whether it's Sunni Islam. However, many of them have tried to remain in these lands and to continue with their families, their homes, and their businesses. The big issue, there's two kind of issues that run parallel. One is on the government level, and one is on the just strictly personal, on the cultural level, and on their family levels as well. When we talk about just traditional Christians, they have their own place in society. They're recognized as a minority. They're limited in their rights. When we talk about Muslims who've decide to change their religion and follow Jesus, then there's another dynamic involved, whether it's cultural or it's governmental. On the governmental level, I think most of these nations, I'm not mistaken, have signed on to the UN Rights Human Charter, so they're supposed to give people rights. In practice, however, Islam doesn't always, in its methodological form from the Quran and the Hadith, doesn't always extend those rights to followers or Muslim who've decided to follow Jesus.
The penalty of which is death in most of those countries.
Yes, it is.
Dr. Kokkonen, is the aspect where the West, which in the past was fundamentally Christian, at least as an institution presenting itself as a Christian society, now significantly less so, is this also a significant factor to the reason that Christians have not really have had a father and mother when we're talking about protection and international coverage of accountability with regard to regimes and various groups pertaining to their persecution?
Yes, so in 2015, when we had this huge influx of refugees coming from the Middle East to Europe, one of the things that was spoken multiple times by different political leaders was that we cannot discriminate based on religion, meaning that we can take Muslims, but when you look at the lists of how many people got asylum, you see that there are hardly any Yazidis, who were the other minority that was persecuted, actually kind of facing a genocide, and hardly any Christians. And I have actually myself went to visit some places firsthand to understand. And what happens is that even if they were able to come to Europe, Germany, or my country, Finland, it's very hard for Christians to live in those centers because the persecution and the discrimination continues, and our authorities are completely unable to understand the role that religion plays in this everyday life. And therefore, they don't really offer any protection to people who fled from there, if they were lucky enough to be able to come in. And now they are facing same type of violence, sometimes very much violence, sometimes it's discrimination that they were facing in their own countries. And I feel that, of course, our governments need to take responsibility, because it's not just a question of how much they want to uphold Christian values, which in Europe has completely gone down, but also a question of human rights. Christians are the most persecuted minority, not minority in the sense of how many followers there are, but they are the most persecuted minority in the Middle East. And therefore, there should be an obligation just based on human rights, based on having signed several treaties to protect them.
I'd like to take actually the Palestinian territories into the equation. When we're talking about the West Bank city of Ramallah, where today we have the Muqatta'a, where the leadership of the Palestinian Authority is situated. In the past, many people don't know, Ramallah was a predominantly Christian city. Today, several years after the PLO actually entered into controlling certain areas, in particular also this specific city, we see less than 20% of the entire population. If in the past it was more than 80%, now less than 20% are Christians. How is this actually possible?
Well, if you look at the Greater Jerusalem area, and you may say that Ramallah is part of that, perhaps the northern part of that, and Bethlehem and Bejala are the southern parts of Greater Jerusalem. You see that obviously Jerusalem being a holy city, holy also to Christianity as well as to Judaism and to Islam, many Christians converged on these parts. Now, when Yasser Arafat started leading the Palestinian national movement, and he had to contend both with an internal problem and with his fight against Israel, he came out with a slogan regarding a secular Palestine, promising equal rights to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. This was propaganda. He didn't really mean it. And we saw that in the very places which you mentioned, Muslims worked to drive out Christians. And we have seen immigration, especially to Latin America. There are several groups in Argentina and other countries in Latin America whose origin is Ramallah or Bethlehem or Bejala. And Israel, too, at one time in the early 70s, had a program where it tried to incentivize Palestinians, no matter what their religion was, to leave Palestine. Unfortunately, most of those who took them up on their offer were Christians who had family preceding them in Latin America, for instance. And now Israel regrets the fact that it's predominantly Muslim. And we haven't even looked at Sunni versus Shiite and secular versus religious. Enough to say that the Muslim vis-a-vis Christian ratio has gone down deplorably in Arab societies.
Mr. Mitchell?
Well, I would say from a media point of view, too, it's very difficult to report on this. I mean, we hear the statistics, and from my understanding, there were a lot of Christians before the Oslo peace process said, please don't do this. They knew what was going to happen, and you see the precipitous drop of percentage of Christians out of Bethlehem, Ramallah, places like that. Many of the Christians in those regions, those cities and towns right now are reluctant to tell their story because they're afraid of retribution. They're afraid their families will be attacked. So telling this story is very difficult. I mean, you can try to hide somebody's identity and keep them safe, but sometimes they're just reluctant to go ahead and
But
do
if I may interject, during Menachem Begin's time in office,
Late 70s.
in the late 70s and early 80s, even though he himself came out of Eastern Europe with a bad experience with some of his Christian neighbors, nevertheless, he believed that Israel has a responsibility towards the Christian minority in Lebanon. And this was one of the reasons for the Lebanon war in 1982, which unfortunately led to the connection with the Phalange, who were not as naive or innocent as Begin wished to believe. One hopes that if there is a Palestinian state side by side with Israel, Israel will feel the same sort of responsibility towards the Christian minority in Palestine, because one cannot really let the Palestinians themselves protect the minorities.
You know, taking also the Gaza Strip into consideration, where Christians are daily persecuted and are demanded by the Islamist Hamas organization to follow actually Muslim rules and regulations. Of course, this puts them in a very difficult situation.
Because this is similar to what is happening to the Copts in Egypt. Correct. And obviously Hamas and the other Islamists in Gaza are influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and they are persecuting.
And taking Lebanon into the picture, of course, Lebanon, when it was formed in the early 20s and a little bit after that, it was a predominantly Christian country. Today, we have a Christian minority in Lebanon. Mr. Kerem, I'd like to touch base on a report that was published about 2 weeks ago about Christian persecution, actually, where there were various figures discussed about 1.5 to 2.5 million Christians that were murdered over the course of 30 years at the beginning of the last century. This was, of course, many Turks and Armenian Christians and many Christians under the, or shortly before and shortly after the Ottoman era. To what degree is this phenomenon where some may call it a genocide, others may call it not so, but it's an atrocious, heinous crime that has been put aside for the fact that they were killed for the sole purpose that they were Christians.
I think that you're referring to Benny Morris's actually book as well, or a report on that. Him and the co-authored with Professor Dror, if I'm not mistaken, on the 30-year genocide referring to the genocide not only of Armenians, which most of probably your viewers are aware of, that happened during World War I, but he takes it from 1894 and goes all the way to 1914, and he calls it a 30-year genocide that included the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Armenians, and other Christian people in the region. I think it's an excellent work. I've heard him interviewed on this. It's a very much of a, it seems like a diversion for him, but I think the book is going to end up being a very important resource. I think he's done a lot of background research on it. He's a man that's trusted in many circles. And personally, I think everybody should read it. So I having studied that era specifically because of the way the World War I influenced the modern Middle East, and looking at what happened in this 30-year period, I think he's right. I think they've gone back, they've seen something that nobody else saw. They've published it. It's not going to make people happy. But I think we're talking about between maybe as many as 2.53 million that were killed during that time. I would say regarding the whole, as we go back and look at the Middle East from World War I up until today, almost 100 years now that have passed, I would say that this after World War I, it was more Arab, or World War II, it was more Arab nationalism. In the 90s, we started to see the beginning, well, maybe even before that with Iran and the Shiite revolution there. But as we get into the 90s and up towards the Second Intifada, we see Arabism sort of fading away into the background and Islamism really taking the forefront. And with that, persecution is going to rise. Because even though Arabism and Arab nationalism wasn't so favorable, there were Christian Arabs that were in the middle of it. They were involved in the Arab nationalist movement. At the same time, when Islamism kind of supersedes Arabism or Pan-Arabism in the Middle East, things begin to change quite radically. I don't know if the statistics I've heard are true, but I've heard Christians in the West Bank tell me that they're now 1% of the population of the total West Bank and decreasing. They represent almost no one anymore. Now, there may be segments in Bethlehem and Ramallah where there's more than 5 to 10%, but generally speaking, I think it's almost down to 1 or 2% in the entire West Bank.
If they include the Jewish settlers, it means that some 400,000 Christians altogether. Yes, that's 1%.
Indeed. Dr. Kokkonen, when the Islamic State came into the picture and the outcry of the Christians for the genocide that was happening under the nose of the international community occurred, the international community was not entirely reluctant to try and deal with the situation. There were military means, there were other aspects that were employed. But now in the, if I may call it this way, the post-Islamic State era, where the Islamic State is all but mitigated to small pockets in different areas, including in the Sinai Peninsula, where they still target Christians, namely the Coptic Christian community there, as Mr. Oren mentioned earlier. Is the international community realizing the degree of persecution happening against Christians in Muslim-majority countries?
Well, I don't think so. Whether it's that they don't know it or they are reluctant to admit it, but certainly not. It seems like any other kind of situation. We have had some in Asia with the Muslims who had to escape, or when there have been bombings of mosques and so on. All of these, they receive a lot of publicity and they become very much a part of talk by politicians as well as media in the West. But when it's Christians, there's a feeling that nobody really cares, that it really isn't an issue. And even when you go somewhere and you talk about genocide and then about the persecution of Christians, it seems to me that people are actually surprised when they hear the statistics. Most people don't know, they never hear that the number of Christians that is being persecuted is so large. But I think also that in terms of the specific issue of the Islamic State and what happened there, is it possible that the world has already moved on and the post-construction and return to where you were living before, this is not an issue that is of such interest to people like it was at the time when they saw the Yazidis trapped in the Sinjar mountain and so on. It's also the issue of so much happening all the time that it's not a priority.
Mr. Owen?
Looks better than it was.
I'd like to touch base on the latter. Mr. Mitchell, there are two organized groups in Israel of extreme religious right-wing groups, for that matter, including Yad L'Achim and Le'ava, which actively seek to curtail Christian way of life and intermarriages, and actually curtail specifically, even more specific, Jews who would like to believe in Jesus. About 2 weeks ago, there was a gathering in Binyan Klal where one of those groups actually came to the Christian gathering, which was supposed to be a worship gathering,
Messianic worship gathering,
Messianic worship gathering. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and what is the challenge Israel faces and the Messianic and Christian community in Israel pertaining to that?
Well, we reported on that, and it was a Messianic worship service. I believe it was a couple of weeks ago on Thursday, where they disrupted it. They threatened some of the people, spit on them, intimidated them, so that people literally had to run a gauntlet actually to get into the worship service. So it's a challenge. I think that was a particularly egregious event at that time. The police actually had a hard time controlling the group that had come. I think it almost took them 7 hours, about 3 different particular waves that they had to issue. So for Messianics, it's a very difficult position here. I think they actually have, perhaps in the 15 years or so, 20 years in the last, maybe been more accepted among general Israeli society, but there are groups, as you had mentioned, that actually target them in different ways. I think, there are some ways of discrimination that they have to suffer. I would like to follow up, too, on an issue that Dr. Kokkonen touched upon.
Please.
Really, I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect between Christian persecution in the Middle East and the church in the West. And it's really kind of disheartening sometimes as a reporter telling their story, and yet sometimes the church in the West just doesn't seem to quite get it. There hasn't been a groundswell of support or prayer or advocacy on their behalf.
I'd like to add in on that too, because I was talking to a Jewish governmental figure, an Israeli governmental figure, who said to me, I find it very strange that when Jews are in any trouble anywhere in the world, there's a helicopter goes, a medical team, there's things mobilized, finances, help. But when Christians are in trouble, I notice that Christian nations, or those with majority Christian population, don't do anything. Can you explain that to me? There's a word in Hebrew, actually, it can be loosely translated as mutual responsibility.
Yeah.
That Christians don't feel mutual responsibility for their brothers in other places. And especially in the Middle East, as I've traveled and met with them, they seem to me, they find it odd. Why aren't our brothers, why aren't our friends in the West showing more solidarity?
Does it have anything to do with Catholics versus Protestants or various denominations?
I've thought about that, and I'm not really sure, because there's those rifts are not as big as they were before. They're still there. There's still issues, but I think it has to do with this idea that they don't want to seem to be favoring. We have this, perhaps in the West, this idea of egalitarianism or sort of impartiality and things like that. So they almost go to the other extreme to
discriminate for.
Yeah, to discriminate for, so they wouldn't be seen to be, doing something on behalf. I'm not sure if it's that, or it has to do with the general focus in the West that is more towards capitalism and economics, less towards security. So they don't really feel it. I'm not going to do anything about it.
So sometimes we don't need to play the judge, but the
to show mercy.
Indeed. Dr. Kokkonen, how do you perceive this?
Well, I think the problem is that also the church in the West is so much focused on what our belief and our faith can give to us, rather than what we are supposed to give to God and to other people because of our faith.
That's good.
Because ultimately, both the Old and the New Testament are very clear that we do have that responsibility, and that if one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. But we don't really see that expressed. Many churches never pray for persecuted Christians. And I think that has to change, because also, if you look at the West and our situation now, there will be questions that are going to require answers from us where we are not going to be agreeing with the wider society.
Mr. Mitchell, we're drawing near to the end of the program. Would you like to give us an assessment? Will the international community wake up as it did back in 2014 during the time of the Islamic State, and actually be more active towards as oversight operation or something in that sense? And will the church wake up at some point towards the challenges that Christians and we are facing here in the region?
Well, let's say I hope so. And I would say Dr. Kokkonen's group just started, Hope for Persecuted Peoples, is trying to address that. And she comes with a unique perspective of working at Yad Vashem for many years, so sees the rise of anti-Semitism and Christian persecution, and hopes to combine those as well, but also engage the church in the West and around the world. This is your brothers and sisters. It's not quite as egregious right now as the ISIS years a few years ago, but still, it goes worldwide, and people need to just stand up, pray, and help their brothers and sisters.
One word?
For what it's worth, Israel will help persecuted Christians, partly because evangelicals are some of its most ardent supporters around the world.
Indeed. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. So I'd like to thank Mr. Mitchell, Mr. Oren, Mr. Kerem, and Dr. Kokkonen for being here today. And I'd like also to thank our viewers and encourage you to pray for Christians being persecuted in the Middle East. And we'll see you again next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.